Moments before dawn, the palace stood unnaturally still, too quiet for a kingdom built on ceremony and control. Behind closed doors, a single light burned inside Kensington Palace. Prince William, the man the world saw as calm, resolute, and unshakable, sat motionless, his hands trembling as he held a sealed envelope marked with his father's royal insignia. The wax seal was intact, its edges pressed with precision, but the weight it carried was unbearable. Hours earlier, the palace had confirmed what Britain feared: King Charles had passed away after a brief, undisclosed illness. But as the nation mourned, another storm brewed in silence. Within that letter, the late king had left behind more than words. He had left a truth powerful enough to fracture the crown itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. They say grief makes even the strongest falter, but this was something different. William read the letter once, then again, his eyes darting across the page, his lips moving silently as though reading a sentence he could not believe. When he reached the end, the silence shattered. The echo of something heavy striking the floor, a chair, perhaps, was followed by muffled sobs. Those who were nearby that morning swore they had never heard the future king cry like that. It wasn't the grief of losing a parent, it was the cry of a man realizing his life had been built upon a lie. The envelope had arrived through a discreet courier just after dawn, labeled simply, "For William Private." It bore the unmistakable handwriting of the late king. Palace staff initially assumed it was a message of affection, a final farewell from a father to his son. But when William locked himself inside his private study and ordered no interruptions, whispers began to stir. The moments stretched into hours, and still, the prince did not emerge. By mid-morning, aides reported strange noises, shouting, then silence. Some claimed they heard him muttering words like betrayal and "why now?" before everything went quiet again. When Catherine approached, she was turned away. The future queen had seen her husband broken before, but never like this. There was something in his eyes when he finally opened the door, a haunting stillness that made even the most loyal staff turn away. It didn't take long for rumors to spread beyond the palace gates. Every major newsroom in London caught wind that something extraordinary had occurred inside Kensington. Anonymous insiders spoke of a life-altering revelation, of a letter so devastating that William refused to share it with anyone, not even his wife. Some speculated it contained confessions about the monarchy's hidden past. Others whispered that it named someone William never expected as part of the royal bloodline. No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain: the future king had changed in that single morning. In a world where image is everything, William's silence became louder than any statement. His aides described him as vacant, staring at the same corner of his desk for hours. One confidant said he looked like a man trying to erase history with his thoughts. Even the official palace press release announcing the king's death felt unusually cold, as though something was being deliberately concealed. That night, the palace gates remained closed, but the eyes of the world stayed fixed on them. William's grief was not public, it was hidden, buried deep beneath duty and expectation. But within those walls, something had cracked. The heir who had always carried himself with control was now drowning in secrets he never asked to inherit. And though he said nothing, his silence screamed louder than words. But as whispers spread through the palace corridors, one haunting question remained: what truth did Charles finally dare to reveal, and why now? Behind the golden walls of Buckingham Palace, where silence carried more weight than words, lived a man haunted by his own choices. King Charles had worn the crown with grace, yet beneath the surface lay a torment that time refused to heal. His final months were not filled with grandeur or comfort, they were consumed by memory, reflection, and guilt. Every night, after the palace halls fell quiet, he would retreat to his private chambers and open the same worn journal, its pages filled with the ghosts of decisions he could no longer defend. Those who served closest to him began to notice his growing isolation. He spoke less of state affairs and more of unfinished truths, his voice distant, as if he were already conversing with the past. The king's private secretary would later reveal that Charles began writing a letter weeks before his final illness. He called it a necessary reckoning, though no one dared to ask what that meant. Some believed it was meant for the archives, a reflection of his reign. Others whispered that it was something far more personal, something meant only for his eldest son. Whatever its purpose, the tone of the king's final writings was not that of a ruler, but of a man seeking forgiveness from the one person he feared had stopped seeing him as a father. In those fragile weeks, Charles returned repeatedly to the same subjects: betrayal, loss, and the unrelenting pressure of duty. He wrote of choices that had broken hearts, of words spoken in anger that could never be taken back. He revisited the final years of Diana's life, her isolation, her pain, and the haunting realization that love and the crown had never been meant to coexist. Those close to him said he would often pause mid-sentence, staring out of the window as if trying to find her in the London sky. "There are things William must know," he murmured one evening, his aide recalled. "Not for sympathy, but for truth." To many, Charles had appeared at peace with his legacy, a monarch who had finally fulfilled his destiny after decades of waiting. But the reality was far darker. His heart carried the weight of a decision that had divided his sons, a mistake, as he called it in one of his final diary entries, that split the brothers beyond repair. Those words revealed the guilt he could no longer conceal. The rivalry between William and Harry had not merely been born of circumstance, it had been cultivated by the very system their father had sworn to protect. And now, in his final days, the king could no longer bear the silence that had protected that truth. Each night, he grew weaker, but his resolve sharpened. He told his most trusted aide, he must know everything. It was not spoken with anger, but with sorrow, the sorrow of a man who finally understood that hiding pain only deepened it. When his hand trembled too much to write, he dictated his final thoughts, piecing together a confession that would serve as both explanation and warning. To Charles, this was not a letter of farewell, it was a plea for understanding, a desperate attempt to bridge a chasm that had swallowed his family whole. And so, with his trembling hand and heavy heart, Charles sealed a truth that would destroy the family image and his son's peace forever. The final night of King Charles's life did not unfold as the palace would later claim. Behind the official statement that spoke of peaceful rest and family presence, the truth was far more haunting. Those last hours were spent in solitude, behind the heavy doors of his private study, doors he had ordered locked from the inside. The king's medical team had been dismissed at his own command. "I need silence," he told them softly, a strange calm in his tone, as though he already knew his time was near. From that moment, not a sound escaped the room. No voices. No music. Only the scratching of a pen on paper and the slow, deliberate ticking of a grandfather clock that marked the final hours of a reign and the beginning of a revelation that would fracture everything that followed. What happened in those hours has since become legend within palace walls. Some say Charles prayed, others claim he spoke to portraits that lined the room, asking for forgiveness from faces long gone. But one detail remains certain, he was writing. 4 hours. Witnesses recall the faint glow of a single candle flickering against the window, a symbolic image of a monarch confronting the darkness he had carried for decades. He refused all communication, rejecting calls from aides and even messages from Camilla. When his private secretary knocked, the king simply responded, "Not tonight. No one must enter." His voice, described as trembling yet resolute, hinted at both fear and finality. By 3 a.m., the silence broke, but not from within. Security logs confirmed that an unidentified visitor was seen leaving the private wing of the palace. The cameras captured only a shadowed figure moving swiftly through the hallway, face obscured, coat collar raised. The palace has never identified the visitor, and to this day, no official record explains who they were or why they had been granted access during those forbidden hours. That mysterious presence would later become the cornerstone of speculation, some whispering it was an old confidant, others daring to suggest it was someone tied to the very secret Charles had written about. Whatever the truth, that visit marked the last time anyone saw him alive. At dawn, a courier dressed in a uniform of the royal household left the palace through a side gate carrying a single sealed envelope marked, "Private to my eldest." It bore the king's personal seal, the same one used for his most confidential correspondence. The courier was instructed to deliver it directly to Prince William's private residence before sunrise. No intermediaries, no explanations. The order came from Charles himself, and it was his final act as king. Hours later, when his chambermaids entered the room, the king was found slumped over his desk, the ink on his final page still wet. But when the palace released its official statement, the timeline did not align. They claimed Charles had passed peacefully at midnight, surrounded by his loved ones. Yet staff records, courier dispatch times, and electronic logs told a different story. Someone had changed the details, altering the final hours of a monarch who had chosen to die not as a king but as a father confessing his last secret. The document sent to William that morning wasn't an ordinary letter. It wasn't a farewell. It was a burden, deliberately passed from one generation to the next. And so, as dawn broke over London, the heir to the throne received the letter that would shatter him. When William opened the envelope that morning, He expected farewell words from a father. What he found instead was an earthquake. When the courier left, the palace returned to its usual stillness. But inside Kensington Palace, the weight of one letter was already rewriting history. William sat alone at his desk, the morning light pale and cold, the envelope before him marked in his father's familiar hand. Private to my eldest. It looked innocent enough, no royal seal, no grandeur. Yet even before opening it, something inside him recoiled. He sensed, without knowing why, that this letter would not bring closure, it would bring devastation. Still, his trembling hands broke the seal, and with a deep breath, he began to read. Witnesses would later recall that he read in silence at first, his face unreadable, his composure intact. But as the minutes passed, that calm cracked. He stopped mid-sentence, blinked hard, then whispered, "It can't be true." He read it again, slower this time, as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less cruel. They didn't. His lips trembled, and before he could reach the final line, he stumbled backward, clutching the letter like it was something burning him. Aides standing outside the study door heard the sound of paper tearing, followed by a sharp cry. Then came silence, long, terrible silence. Hours passed before anyone dared to check on him. When they finally entered, the room was in disarray. The letter lay in pieces across the floor, the seal broken beyond repair. The heir to the British throne sat slumped in his chair, his eyes red, his face buried in his hands. It wasn't just grief. It was disbelief, a kind that corrodes the soul. He had always believed his father's past was complicated, but forgivable. Now he realized it was neither. The letter contained words that no son should ever have to read. Charles had written of betrayal and forgiveness denied. He spoke of a choice that had protected the crown but destroyed the woman he once loved. The confessions were not about affairs or politics, they were about Diana, her isolation, her final days. Charles admitted to a decision made in fear, not love, a choice that ensured the monarchy's survival but came at the cost of his own humanity. It was, in his own words, the sin that shaped us all. And as William read those words, the world he had built around duty, order, and loyalty began to crumble. At one point, he tried to gather the pieces, as if he could somehow undo what he had learned. He reread a surviving fragment that spoke of a meeting one that took place days before Diana's death, and something in those lines broke him completely. He cried not as a prince, but as a son who suddenly understood that the walls around his family had been built not from protection, but from guilt. Catherine found him hours later, sitting in the same position, eyes vacant. She didn't ask what had happened, she already knew. The look on his face said everything, the kind of pain that can't be spoken aloud. She reached for the torn fragments, but he stopped her, shaking his head. "No one can read it," he whispered. "Not yet." But even as he tried to compose himself, a single thought gnawed at his mind, a detail that refused to fade. Amid all the pain and confession, one line stood apart from the rest. A single sentence, written in his father's own hand, that turned heartbreak into fury. It was short, chilling, and final. And though the world would never see it, that sentence would change the future of the monarchy forever. But even through the heartbreak, one detail haunted him most, a single sentence that turned shock into fury. Hidden near the end of the letter, written in his father's careful hand, were 9 words that tore through William's soul like a blade. The bloodline must be protected, no matter the cost. That single sentence changed everything. It was the moment where grief became disbelief, disbelief became suspicion, and suspicion turned into fury. Until that moment, William had believed his father's words to be confessions of regret, a man's attempt at redemption in his final hours. But this line wasn't repentance, it was justification. It implied that the choices Charles made, the pain he inflicted, and the people he sacrificed were all deliberate, all done in the name of one chilling obsession, preserving the royal bloodline. Those words echoed in William's head, over and over again, as if mocking him. The bloodline must be protected. Protected from whom? Protected from what? He read the phrase again, this time noticing the deliberate weight behind each word, the way his father had underlined it, as if to ensure he'd never forget. Beneath it, almost as an afterthought, Charles had written, "Forgive me when you know why." That final plea only deepened the confusion. Forgive him for what? For lies? For cover-ups? For secrets that had never seen daylight? The heir to the throne was now left with a question that no crown, no duty could answer. In the hours that followed, William's mind became a storm. He thought of Diana, his mother, the one woman whose truth had been silenced in the name of royal image. He remembered her words in interviews, her warnings that there were forces beyond my understanding. For years, those phrases had been dismissed as paranoia. Now, reading his father's confession, they felt like prophecy. Protecting the crown from her truth, that was how Charles had described his decision. A decision made in fear, not love. And suddenly, it all connected. Diana's isolation, her exile within the very palace walls, her final cries for freedom every moment pointed back to one man and one motive: preservation of a lineage that demanded obedience over humanity. It wasn't only Diana's name that haunted the letter. Hidden between the lines were hints of more recent deceptions, ones involving Harry and Meghan, the couple driven into exile under the same doctrine of control. The parallels were undeniable. The manipulation, the media smears, the sudden withdrawal of protection, it was all too familiar. William felt sick realizing how history had repeated itself under his father's command. The monarchy, it seemed, hadn't been built on honor or service. It was built on concealment. Catherine tried to reach him, pleading for calm. Some truths were never meant to be opened, she whispered, her voice trembling. But William couldn't stop. Every word in that letter was an attack on everything he believed in: his father's integrity, his mother's memory, and his own future as king. The family he had devoted his life to defending had turned out to be the architect of its own moral collapse. He looked down at the fragments of the letter one last time. The ink was smudged from his tears, but that one line remained clear, refusing to fade: the bloodline must be protected. The meaning was monstrous in its simplicity. His father had sacrificed truth to preserve power, love to preserve image, and humanity to preserve the throne. And now, that legacy rested on William's shoulders. But for William, silence was no longer an option, and his next move would divide the royal family forever. Behind the palace's polished facade, Catherine carried a burden that was not her own, yet felt heavier with each passing day. She had seen the letter. She had seen the change in William's eyes, the quiet rage, the sleepless nights, the distance growing between them like a widening chasm. She didn't need to ask what was in it, she already knew. The letter was poison disguised as truth, and her husband was unraveling beneath its weight. Yet, while William's pain burned outward, Catherine's response was silence. Her strength had always been her composure, but now that calm became armor. She moved through the palace corridors with measured grace, concealing what others might have called fear, but what for her was strategy. In private, she confronted William, her voice trembling not with anger, but desperation. "Don't destroy what's left," she pleaded. "Whatever your father wrote, it doesn't have to define you." But William's silence was answer enough. He had crossed a threshold he could not return from. Catherine realized then that her role had shifted. She was no longer simply his confidant. She was his protector from the institution, from the press, and most painfully, from himself. At night, when he couldn't sleep, she would find him standing by the window, clutching one of the torn fragments of the letter. He wasn't just mourning his father, he was questioning the very legacy he had been raised to inherit. Behind closed doors, Catherine began reaching out quietly to senior aides, people she could still trust. Her conversations were cautious, filled with phrases that hinted but never confessed. She was trying to contain something that could no longer be contained. One aide later revealed that Catherine's tone was that of a woman fighting a war she couldn't name. She knew the monarchy was built on silence, on burying scandal beneath layers of duty and denial. But this time, she feared, silence might not be enough. Rumors were already circulating, whispers of a letter, a revelation, a truth that could end the crown. The emotional toll seeped into their home life. The children felt the tension even when words were spared. William had grown distant, short-tempered, distracted, while Catherine tried to keep normalcy alive through routines that now felt like rituals of survival. Eventually, she made a decision that startled even her closest advisors: to move part of the family temporarily to Windsor. Officially, it was for privacy and schooling, but those who knew her best understood the real reason. She needed distance from the palace, from the whispers, and from the danger of being caught in the crossfire of her husband's unraveling and the institution's fear. Still, Catherine couldn't shake one thought: the sense that the letter's existence was no longer confined to their private grief. One evening, she turned to William and said quietly, "What if it leaks on its own?" Her voice cracked slightly, not out of doubt, but dread. William didn't respond. He didn't have to. Because deep down, they both understood something far worse than betrayal was coming, not from within their marriage, but from beyond their control. But fate was faster than caution, because within days, a leak did come, and it threatened to undo the royal family in public view. It began with a whisper in the dark corners of the internet, a single screenshot posted on an encrypted forum with no source, no timestamp, and no verification. Yet the words it contained were enough to ignite a firestorm that would consume the monarchy. The image appeared to show a fragment of King Charles's final letter, the one the palace had sworn was private, sealed, and unseen. The line read, "The bloodline must be protected, no matter the cost." Within minutes, it spread like wildfire across social media. By dawn, it wasn't just a rumor, it was a global scandal. Headlines screamed of royal deceit, buried confessions, and the king's forbidden truth. The monarchy, once protected by silence, now stood naked before the world. Inside Buckingham Palace, chaos reigned. Senior aides scrambled to contain what they called the leak of the century. Phones were confiscated. Internal networks were shut down. Every corridor buzzed with fear as whispers of betrayal echoed behind closed doors. The palace issued a brief, defensive statement, calling the document fabricated, but it was too late. Screens across the globe replayed the same haunting line over and over. The damage was done. For the first time in modern memory, the monarchy had lost control of its own narrative, and the nation could smell blood. The public response was immediate and unforgiving. Social media erupted with theories linking the confession to Diana's final days, Meghan's exile, and the ongoing tensions between William and Harry. Commentators dissected every word of the leaked text, suggesting it confirmed decades of speculation about hidden truths, manipulated legacies, and royal cover-ups. Protesters gathered outside palace gates demanding transparency. The once revered institution was now painted as a machine built on secrets and sacrifice. Parliament itself began to murmur of inquiry, calling quietly for clarity on matters that concern the public trust. Behind the marble walls of the palace, the whispers turned into panic. William watched it all unfold with a hollow stare. Pale, sleepless, and worn thin, he realized that what he had tried to bury, the pain, the confession, the bloodline secret, had clawed its way into daylight. The world was now dissecting his father's final words, twisting them into narratives the palace could no longer control. Catherine stood by him, urging restraint, but the look in his eyes said it all. The war between truth and duty had begun, and there was no winning it. Reporters camped outside their residence, demanding answers. Tabloids published speculative timelines, alleging that the letter was linked to a decades-old royal deception. Even allies within government began to distance themselves, fearing the monarchy's credibility was disintegrating by the hour. When William finally broke his silence, his voice trembled not with weakness, but with exhaustion. "Some things must remain sacred," he said in a brief, televised address. It was meant to calm the storm, but instead, it fed the flames. Critics accused him of hiding behind tradition. Others saw a man protecting his family's humanity amid chaos. The public was split, the palace divided, and the monarchy teetering on the edge of collapse. Meanwhile, the image of King Charles began to shift in the public eye. To some, he became a martyr, a man whose final act was to tell the truth his predecessors had buried. To others, he was a manipulator, a dying monarch who detonated his own dynasty out of guilt. No one could agree on which version was real. And perhaps that was the point. The power of the letter wasn't in its authenticity, but in the chaos it unleashed. It blurred the line between myth and reality, between loyalty and survival. As the world debated whether Charles's final words were confession or revenge, one thing became clear: silence was no longer protection, it was exposure. But while the world debated the king's intentions, William was preparing to act not as a son, but as a sovereign. Days after the chaos, Britain waited in silence. The streets outside Buckingham were lined with cameras, crowds, and unanswered questions. And then he appeared, Prince William, no longer the grieving son but a man transformed by loss, burden, and revelation. His eyes were red from sleepless nights, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady, resolute, almost defiant. The world expected mourning. What they witnessed instead was the birth of a sovereign forged in fire. "There comes a time," he began, "when silence becomes complicity." It was not the speech of a man shielding a dynasty, it was the declaration of one determined to rebuild it, even if it meant tearing down the walls his father had fought to preserve. Behind that calm expression burned a decision that would alter the monarchy's course forever. William would not repeat his father's mistakes. He would not let the truth rot behind the gold doors of the palace, whispered only among those paid to keep it. The era of secrecy, he believed, had destroyed too much his mother's peace, his brother's loyalty, his father's legacy. If the crown was to survive, it had to bleed honestly before it could heal. The speech was brief, but every word carried the weight of a man standing at war with both his past and his destiny. Inside the palace, the reaction was instant and divided. Some of his father's closest aides called the move reckless, a betrayal of everything Charles had spent his reign protecting. Others, quietly and perhaps reluctantly, called it brave. The crown had always depended on mystery, on distance, on carefully curated illusion. But William saw that illusion for what it was: a gilded cage that devoured those within it. His decision to declassify parts of the royal archives sent shockwaves through both the institution and Parliament. Centuries of controlled narratives and half-truths were suddenly under threat of exposure. For the first time in living memory, the monarchy seemed not untouchable, but human. Those closest to William knew the choice came at a personal cost. His relationship with certain senior courtiers collapsed overnight. There were whispers of resignations, private arguments, even threats of withdrawal from senior royals who still clung to Charles's philosophy of silence. But William was unmoved. To him, truth had become not a risk but redemption. His father's letter had been a wound. The leak had been the infection. Transparency, no matter how painful, would be the cure. The monarchy, he told one advisor, must be built on trust or it won't be built at all. Through it all, Catherine stood beside him not as the quiet figure the public adored, but as his anchor in the storm. Her approval was never spoken aloud, but visible in every deliberate choice she made. She knew the dangers, knew how deeply the family would resist, yet she never once urged retreat. Their partnership became unspoken defiance, two people united not by tradition, but by conviction. As William ended his address, the nation stood divided but captivated. Some hailed him as a reformer, others condemned him as the man dismantling the crown from within. But behind the words, behind the solemn vow of honesty, there lingered something darker. The king who had inherited both power and pain was still haunted by one truth left untold, because buried deep within the archives he had just promised to open, one final document remained sealed. But the story didn't end with revelation, it deepened, because one last document remained unopened, hidden beneath the royal seal. The palace had barely begun to recover from the storm when another shock quietly surfaced, one that would plunge the monarchy back into darkness. It began not with a public revelation, but with a whisper from deep within the royal archives. An archivist, cataloging documents under strict orders of secrecy, stumbled upon an unmarked drawer sealed by a code not used since King Charles's reign. Inside lay a single envelope, untouched, preserved in a thick layer of dust. It bore William's name once again, his full title written in his father's unmistakable hand. But this time, the seal was crimson heavy, and ominously inscribed with 3 words that froze the archivist where he stood: "For your eyes only." The discovery sent quiet ripples through the palace staff, but within hours, the find was buried, locked away, classified, and swiftly denied. Official channels claimed no such letter existed, no such record was found. But those close to the royal household whispered otherwise. They claimed it was real, that it had been quietly delivered to the king in private, away from advisors and aides. Whatever the contents were, it was clear that Charles's first letter, the one that tore open the monarchy's heart, had not been the end. It had been a prelude. And now, the second message threatened to undo the fragile balance William had built since his father's passing. Those who saw William in the days following the discovery said his demeanor shifted once more. The firm resolve that had defined his first months as king seemed to fracture. His public appearances grew colder, his tone more distant. Behind the composure, a shadow settled, an unease that could not be masked, even by years of royal training. He stopped discussing reform, halted his initiative to release the remaining archives, and withdrew from advisors who had once been his closest allies. Whatever was written in that second letter had shaken him to his core. It wasn't grief this time, it was knowledge. And knowledge, in the royal world, was more dangerous than confession. Catherine, ever observant, noticed the change before anyone else. In a rare moment of private candor, she was overheard saying to a confidant, "The past will never rest." It was both a lament and a warning. The very truth that William had once sought to expose now seemed to be consuming him. The second letter, it seemed, was not written to heal but to haunt. And if the first had destroyed illusions, the second may have revealed something far worse, something about the monarchy's foundation that could never be spoken aloud. Outside the palace, whispers began again. The media, hungry for another royal scandal, speculated endlessly about what the mysterious letter might contain. Some said it held the identity of a person long erased from royal history. Others believed it revealed a pact between the crown and government, one that kept certain truths buried in exchange for public stability. Theories multiplied, fear spread, and once again, the monarchy found itself standing on the edge of myth and madness. Through it all, William said nothing. The letter never appeared in any official record, and no one outside his private circle ever saw it again. But from that day forward, something intangible shifted in him, a quiet dread, a guardedness that even Catherine could not break. And though the world would never learn what King Charles wrote in his final message, the weight of those words would hang over the crown like a curse. And so, the letter meant to bring closure became the beginning of a new royal mystery, one that Britain will never stop trying to solve.